I am Carl Weinreich, Marketing Manager for QTAC Fire and Rescue Apparatus, and in this podcast, QTAC President Jason Black, VP of Sales Jim Burge, and myself spoke with CAL FIRE Battalion Chief Shem Hawkins, who was one of 3 Air Tactical Group Supervisors at the Chico CAL FIRE Air Attack Base. Jason, this was a pretty interesting podcast.
It was, and the reason that we wanted to talk to somebody involved with the CAL FIRE Air Attack aerial firefighting program is because it gets a huge amount of attention, not just CAL FIRE, but also with contractors who work for the state.
Right.
We're used to seeing, at least in this part of the country, we're used to seeing planes flying all summer long. When you see that, you wonder how does that operation work and what goes into that.
Absolutely.
And there's a lot of debate as to the effectiveness of aerial firefighting, but there is no debate as to how intricate and how taxing this job is.
Yeah.
And so we just thought it would be a really fun time, and it was. It was a great interview with Shem, smart guy. You know, Shem's been in CAL FIRE since 1992, tons of experience. And he is, as he'll explain here, he's the guy sitting up in an OV-10 Bronco, circling the fire and directing traffic, and the level of stress.
You can hear it in his voice.
You can hear it, yeah. I mean, it's something that the average person, the average pilot, if you're into aviation, is just not going to experience.
Yeah, for sure. The other thing that was so interesting to me was the unmanned aircraft. Where this is going to end up going for aerial firefighting with unmanned aircraft is pretty interesting.
Yeah, the fact that he touched on that right away when he first walked in the door was interesting to me, because that's not something I thought was even going to come up in this discussion. So yeah, fun discussion with Battalion Chief Shem Hawkins. Really appreciate his time coming in, and we hope that everyone out there listening learns something and begins to understand what it is they're doing and how important it is, but also how dangerous it is and what they have to do to train and be prepared.
For sure. All right, well, everybody, enjoy. As always, we want to reiterate that views and opinions of our guests do not reflect the views and opinions of QTAC or our corporate entity, MTech Incorporated. We enjoy different perspectives and great conversations with intelligent and well-informed people in our industry. For more information about QTAC Fire and Rescue Apparatus, make sure and check out our website at qtacfire.com.
Battalion Chief Shem Hawkins, thanks for joining us.
Absolutely. Pleasure to be here.
Chief Hawkins, you're assigned to the Chico Air Attack Base, and which is literally a few hundred yards from us down the road here. And for our listeners out there who may not be from California or this part of the country, when you see a white, red, and black aircraft dropping water or fire retardant these days, chances are it's a CAL FIRE aircraft.
Yes.
In California.
Mm-hmm.
We want to sit down and talk to you because the image of that firefighting aircraft dropping that on a line has become almost iconic. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of questions and interest. What does it take? What does it require? And how does that operation work? And so we just want to sit down and talk to you about that.
Great.
But first, can you give us some background on you, your firefighting career, and kind of what led you to this place?
Yeah, absolutely. So I started with CAL FIRE. My father was a firefighter with CAL FIRE for 54 fire seasons in California here. And so in 1992, when I turned 18, I joined CAL FIRE as well. And so I worked seasonally while I went to college. I went to UC Davis, got my degree in civil engineering, and worked in the summer times as a firefighter. And I also worked at UC Davis Fire Department during the off season while I was employed, or while I was going to college at Davis. And I graduated in 98 with a civil engineering degree, worked a year as a civil engineer, but came back to CAL FIRE in 99 because I enjoyed helping people.
And what led you to the position you're at now as BC of the Air Attack Base?
You know, I worked a variety of jobs throughout CAL FIRE. So CAL FIRE is a pretty multidisciplinary department. We do a whole bunch of different things, all the way from I worked as a paramedic on an engine company. I worked on a ladder truck. I worked on Schedule B four-wheel drive fire engines out in the middle of nowhere. Finally, I was transferring to the Butte unit, and they asked me if I wanted to go to the Air Attack School, which is kind of a specialized program within CAL FIRE. And it was something different for me. It's always good to keep different things moving forward because I think that's how you progress as a human, and I had very little aviation experience. So I thought it was a great opportunity, and I took the opportunity, jumped it, and it's been very challenging and very rewarding over the years to be able to participate with that.
And what sort of training goes on at the Air Tac School?
So the Air Tac School is a 2-week training course where they kind of give you the fundamentals of what you do as an air tac and how you bridge the gap between the air resources and the ground resources. I think people are under the illusion that the air resources are the ones that put out the fire, but we just slow and decrease the intensity of the fire so that the ground firefighters can get in and do the arduous labor of cutting a line around the fire to be able to put it out. And so the training course is 2 weeks, and then past that you start doing your task book, and that's about usually a 6 to 8 week assignment, riding on a plane with an air tac, qualified air tac, going to fires and helping learn those skills on how you fundamentally operate safely over the top of the fire, in what we call the fire traffic area, and bridge the gap between those air resources and the ground resources.
There's I don't know if this is still up to date, but there's 13 air attack bases in California. Is that right? Does your assignment cover any other local bases like Vina, or is it strictly Chico?
It is strictly Chico. So I cover Chico, and then I've also been given a collateral duty of helping to stand up the state's UAS program, or the Unmanned Aerial Systems program.
Yeah, and that's something we'll talk about here in a minute, because I think that where that's going is very interesting.
It is.
Yeah. What's your primary role as battalion chief at the base?
So as a primary role, I supervise 2 captains. We're all certified Air Tactical Group Supervisors. So one of us is on duty every day, riding in the back of the plane, working with the pilot to help coordinate the airspace over the top of the incidents.
So the Air Tactical Group Supervisor?
Yes.
Is in the OV-10 Bronco?
Yes.
That's what you're doing?
Yep. I ride in the back seat and work with the pilot to help coordinate the aircraft, the air tankers and the helicopters.
That's got to get hectic at times.
Oh, it's probably the busiest job I've ever done in the state. So I worked for a little bit as a battalion chief in the Bay Area. I've worked as a battalion chief in the field and up here. But by far and away, the Air Tactical Group Supervisor job is probably one of the most hectic, demanding jobs mentally that I've ever done.
Were you in that position when the campfire started?
Mm-hmm.
So you're over the campfire watching the town you grew up in.
Yes.
What was that like?
It was at the time, it was a very business situation, because you have a job to do and you focus on it. It's the dealing with the after effects afterwards. The people who have been affected by something so traumatic. That was probably one of the more moving experiences I've had.
For anybody who's listening who may not be caught up on the campfire, that was the fire in 2018 that happened here locally in November, and it was one of the most destructive wildfires in history, especially in state history. So to be dealing with that as a local and in the fire service, I've heard that from many people that it was very difficult. You kind of mentioned this earlier, but what do you think is the biggest difference between the public perception of aerial firefighting and the reality of what it is doing and what it provides? Because you hear oftentimes, and usually it's on a news report or somebody's getting interviewed, and it's either, thank God they sent the aircraft and we're saved, or somebody who's criticizing, saying, had they done this wouldn't have happened. And so you're kind of stuck in this middle ground of public perception, but there's a lot of challenges in what you do from terms of visibility and wind and everything else, right?
Right, exactly. So some of the environmental conditions really limit our use of aircraft over the top of fires. Once the wind starts to get above 25, 30 miles an hour, 40 miles an hour, depending on what the terrain is like, it really limits us being able to fly the fixed-wing aircraft. Helicopters can sometimes do a little bit better, but again, it becomes very difficult. Now, you have to have at least 3 miles to be able to drop a plane. They're moving so quickly and they can't hold their position. So if the visibility drops below that, then we have to start setting the fixed wing down. Helicopters have a little bit more latitude, but again, it becomes everybody remembers the tragic accident that happened to Kobe Bryant, where all of a sudden you lose visibility and the mountain appears in front of you. And so that's what we're trying to avoid with our aircraft. But the public also believes that the aircraft puts the fires out. We just slow and reduce the intensity of the fire so that the ground firefighters can put the fire out. So the engines, crews, hand crews, the bulldozers that are actually out there constructing line around the fire, they're the ones who put the fire out. We just give them the conditions temporarily for them to aggressively move in on the fire.
And how does that coordination work between air, ground, incident commander, you? What does that look like on a busy incident?
Well, what happens is once I get there to the incident with the aircraft, then I contact that ground IC, incident commander, and find out what his objectives are. And then I give him suggestions on what I can do with the aircraft to help meet his objectives. So the Air Tactical Group Supervisor works for the incident commander, the ground IC, and we use these aircraft in coordination with what he's doing to further the overall objectives and put the fire out as quick as possible.
What determines the size aircraft brought in? And so if somebody wants that, if it's a VLAT versus an S2 or something like that, what determines that? Is it terrain? Is it size of the fire? How fast it's spreading?
So anytime, what we do in California in the summertime is, everybody's seen the environmental change as we start to move into summertime. You start out somewhat green, then you start to move into more brown conditions, and we start to gauge our resources dispatched based on what the environmental conditions are presenting. Now, in the heat of summer, we're typically in a very high dispatch level or high dispatch level. And with that, we always send to every fire that's reported one air tac, two S2 air tankers, or two air tankers that are the closest resource. So, for instance, if we have a Type 1 air tanker, our S2 air tanker is a Type 3 air tanker. It's a smaller, carries a maximum of 1,200 gallons. But if we have a Type 1 air tanker at Chico, which sometimes we do, we'll have 3,000 gallons on board. We'll send that one, and then we also send a helicopter with crew on it. So it has a ground crew that the helicopter will insert, and you see one locally here at Vina. So the new Black Hawk helicopter carries the Vina crew.
Can you go a little bit into the different aircraft that is in the fleet and how they're used?
Yeah, absolutely. So with those aircraft, we have what we call the initial attack aircraft, and that's kind of that S2 air tanker. The S2 air tanker is an old Navy aircraft that was repurposed for air tanking, or to be an air tanker by CAL FIRE in the late 70s, and then they were repowered and re-engineered a little bit in the 90s to be able to provide a little more longevity to the program. Great aircraft. That's our primary bread and butter. We've got 23 of those throughout the state, and 22 of them are staffed on a day-to-day basis, and we always send the closest air tanker to the fire. So we could be getting one from Grass Valley, we could be getting one from Redding, we could get one from Chico. Whichever one's the most available, closest, we'll send those to the fire. Now, we also contract with other aircraft. There's some private vendors out in the aviation world that provide Type 1 air tankers. And those are aircraft that have 3,000 gallons or more available. And they can typically drop at a little higher coverage level, and but there's not quite as many of them. It kind of varies on a year-to-year basis on how many are available throughout the Western U.S., but it's usually around like 20, 23, something like that. And then the next category of aircraft is what we call the VLATs, or the very large air tankers. And those are, I believe we had 4 of them this year available throughout the Western U.S. And typically there's one at McClellan, and that carries 9,400 gallons. They're all
so
contractors.
That's the 10 tankers or Colson or somebody like that.
Affirmative.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. And how do those? And this may be getting too much in the weeds, but how do those contracts work? I mean, what determines who's brought in and what aircraft and how they get used throughout the state?
Mm-hmm. So there's a couple different ways. The primary method is what's called an exclusive use contract. So CAL FIRE or the Forest Service or BLM might set forth a contract, put it out to bid for these companies, and say, hey, we anticipate hiring 4 or 5 of the aircraft this year at a specific rate, specific daily rate, a specific hourly rate, if you fly, and so the different companies will bid on those contracts. And at some point, either the Forest Service or CAL FIRE will award the contracts to the companies, and then they're required to be on base at a specific time for a specific time period. Then the other one is what's called a call when needed contract. And so those usually come at a higher cost, a higher rate, and it could be for a specific time, or it could be for, or typically it could be for a very short time period, or it could be for an extended time period if the fire season gets bad.
So going back to a busy day in the summer, what does that look like for you in terms of like when are you getting there, or is it? I mean, how much could you be in an aircraft, and what does that coordination look like at this base, for instance?
Yeah.
Just give people an idea of what your day would look like.
Yeah, well, typically we start at 10:45 in the morning. The aircraft come on duty, but in special cases, so if they know that they have a fire and they need to get the aircraft up earlier, then by all means, they just give me a call. We get over to the base. We staff it at whatever time. The pilots, by contract, can be at the base for 14 hours. The maximum flight hours they can do are 7 flight hours for a single piloted aircraft. And then if they have 2 pilots where they're sharing the duties, it's not as taxing, then they can fly for 8 hours. And so, yeah, typically if we have fires going, we'll fly for 7 hours every day in up and down the state.
It's a lot of time in the air.
It is.
Every day, yeah.
How do they work that? Do they, like, one goes off and does a certain number of sorties and comes back, and then the next guy goes out, or how do they?
No, they're both in the aircraft. Yeah,
okay.
So certain aircraft require 2 pilots.
Okay.
And many of the Type 1 helicopters that we get, the bigger helicopters, like the Chinook, they have 2 pilots, or some of the Type 1 air tankers, they'll have 2 pilots. So they're kind of sharing the duties. It's not as taxing for one pilot who has to run the radio, talk to the FAA, get over the top of the fire, fuel the aircraft, and do it. They kind of split the load, so it's not quite as taxing for everyone. And so we give them a little bit longer of a duty day.
In a large fire situation, how many sorties a day may they run?
Well, it really depends on how close the fire is to the base, but it's not uncommon to see them do 20 or if it's relatively close. Yeah.
In terms of the coordination and what you do on a daily basis, is there anything that you think would be surprising to people? Like if someone was just a fly on the wall or on the cockpit glass and watching you do what you do, what would be maybe the biggest surprise to the general public about what that looks like and what you're seeing and what you're doing from the air?
I think it would be kind of surprising to the general public to see how little I can see sometimes, particularly in the smoky conditions. They think that once the aircraft get over the top and they see it from the ground level where they're looking up through relatively easier sight picture than when you're going over 100 miles an hour looking at a dense cloud of smoke. So I think that your sight picture changes, and I don't think that the public really realizes how difficult it is for these great pilots and how they're moving low level through that kind of changing conditions, and it's not as easy to see.
And then is there set altitudes for everybody coming in? How do you stay where there's no conflict with aircraft?
Yeah. So back in 2001, there was a tragic accident in CAL FIRE. It was called the bus incident, and 2 air tankers collided. And so after that, we started creating what we call the fire traffic area now. And so it's modeled on the Class Delta airspace, where the Air Tac is kind of at the top of the stack or the pyramid or cylinder over the top of the incident. So we're at 2,500 feet. The air tankers, the fixed wing planes, will come in at 1,500 feet, and then the helicopters are 500 feet and below. And then we also do what's called, that's vertical separation, and then we'll also do horizontal separation. So we'll start spacing the aircraft out to be able to ensure that they don't collide over the top of the incident. So in the bus incident, they weren't calling in at specific time intervals, or they were kind of working off time rather than specific mileage parameters. And what we did is we switched it to a mileage parameter. So at 12 miles, the aircraft have to start calling in. And then I'll give those aircraft clearance into the incident so that we can operationally use them. At 7 miles, they'll call in again. And if they don't get a response, then they hold at 7 miles until we can free up the airspace to get them in. Same thing with the helicopters. As we start working over the top of the incident, then we start to, what we do, kind of like mesh those aircraft, kind of like gears, cogs on gears, right? And the helicopters will be going in for a water drop, and they'll typically grab water out of the closest pond or lake or river or wherever we can find some good water to be able to put on the fire. And the air tankers will drop the retardant, but obviously we can't have the planes and the helicopters at the spot at the same time. So we'll hold the helicopters out at the dip site and we'll drop the retardant. And then once the air tanker's off, then we'll clear the helicopter back in for some more water. So we kind of have a little bit of a flow, a synchronous flow, where we try to work the aircraft around the incident.
It sounds extremely stressful. I mean, that I cannot imagine trying. And you're basically ATC, you're air traffic control, but in a volatile, dynamic situation there.
Yeah, it is. It's very mentally taxing. So I've got 6 radios and a total of 9 frequencies. So there's a lot going on, and I'm sure you've been in that situation where you've heard multiple people talking in different directions at the same time, and that really is what we're faced with in the back of the aircraft. So we do some cool things where we stack the volumes of the radios, and obviously, I mean, the most important radio traffic we're going to hit is going to be the other aircraft, right? Because we want to keep everybody separated. So we'll keep them tuned up the most, and then the next most important is going to be the ground guys, right? So we want to make sure that we're not going to hit anyone on the ground, because if we're dropping 1,000 gallons of retardant at 9 pounds per gallon, that's 9,000 pounds going out at 150 miles an hour. We can kill somebody very easily. We got to keep that separation, so we want to talk to the ground resources. I'll keep them up the next. And then the command channel will be down the lowest. So we kind of stack the radios based on what's most important and keep those air resources the loudest.
Yeah.
So,
quick question on as those aircraft are in altitude or being stacked, for that coordination so they don't run into each other. At what altitude do they come in to deliver their agent?
So it kind of depends. The helicopters will be pretty low. They'll go pretty low, 50 feet or so. Really depends on what kind of aircraft they have and how quickly they're going to be dropping and how the tank can open up. So they know their aircraft the best. The air tankers, what we do is we will typically do about 120 knots or so, 150 feet off the ground. Now the VLAT, we keep him a little higher. So he'll do 250 feet off the ground.
Okay. So not only do you have everybody going around in a circle, like in this cylinder, but then you have people doing the dipping up and down, up and down. That's mind-boggling to keep it all straight so people don't run into each other.
Well, they're very good. Our pilots are very good at that coordinated dance, and thankfully we don't have any accidents. But I'll tell you what, it's the one thing I worry about every summer.
This week's Fire Break is about the newly released QTAC 70 HPK firefighting skid. When you need a unit with a great balance of water capacity, fire suppression power, and value, step up to the QTAC 70 HPK, our high-pressure UTV and truck fire skid. The front-mounted pump and plumbing system makes adjusting and starting the 70 HPK more convenient. Add a foam system or other optional equipment like a Viper nozzle with bail shutoff, and make this unit a true all-arounder for your property protection. Find more information about the 70 HPK at qtacfire.com. What's
the most, maybe the most involved or hectic incident you can remember being in?
The campfire was very, very difficult because in that scenario, we weren't able to do that much, but there was a lot going on. So I was listening to a lot, but I wasn't able to do a lot. The helicopters, we were able to keep working, but for instance, the fixed wing, the first drops that we were trying to do that morning, we started trying to drop retardant at about 7:45, 7:50 in the morning, and the pilot, he came into the incident, and The first thing they'll do is they have to descend, so they'll cut the power, pull the power back, and as he pulled the power back, he actually started to climb. And that's because of the wind patterns that you see coming over the top of the mountain. So he hit the updraft, basically, and on the backside, nature abhors the vacuum, right? So you're going to have a downdraft at some point. So he almost turned over that morning. So we always try to give it a shot to see what we can do with the aircraft. Unfortunately, it just wasn't going to be able to work because the winds were 70 miles an hour plus. So it was way outside our spectrum. And then if they do release at that speed, at that wind speed, what you'll find is that the air retardant doesn't actually hit the ground. It aerates and it just blows away. So the effectiveness on the ground, the coverage level is pretty pointless.
So there is a lot that goes, whether it's terrain, weather, wind, there's a lot that goes into the decision-making process on where you can drop and what you can do.
Exactly. 100%.
How does terrain affect that?
Well, the way that I kind of define terrain, we got a couple different things. So on a static day, terrain, the maneuvering the fixed-wing aircraft into steep terrain is very, very difficult for them. And so it's energy management. They'll start up high. They'll start at 1,500 feet AGL, and they've got to bleed off their energy to get down low into the canyon to get at that right 120 knots, 150 feet to be able to drop it. And that's kind of like hitting a major league fastball, if you know what I mean, just right there, right? So they'll descend down, and they have some techniques to be able to bleed off that potential energy so it doesn't translate into kinetic energy. And so they'll whop their wings and extend their downwind. But in certain scenarios, the canyons can be so deep and so steep that it's difficult to work the fixed wing down close to the bottom. So North Fork of the Feather River is a prime example that we'll see around here. It's very difficult for the pilots to get down low level. So what we'll do is we'll say, okay, we're going to work the upper third with the fixed wing, and then down low level, we'll put the helicopters down there. Since they have a little bit better maneuverability and their flight profile works a little better. Now, the difficult thing is when you start to throw really high winds in that scenario. And so the analogy that I'll typically use is think of like a water flowing through a creek. And so you can go over to Big Chico Creek and you can take a look at it, and you'll see as the water flows over rocks, you'll get eddies on the backside, and you'll get these deep dives and pushes, and you can feel the water move on your body. Same thing's happening, but magnified when you're up in the air. And the air is flowing over the tops of this topographic features that you may see. So a mountain is no different than a rock in the river. And so you'll see very similar flow characteristics of the fluid around that rock that you will experience when you're flying in an aircraft around the mountain. It's just, it can push you at the wrong time. And unfortunately, we have had a lot of accidents in the aviation community, particularly with CAL FIRE and the firefighting community, where we have had people pushed into mountains and rocks. So the pilots have become very attuned to it, and they train a lot on it. But we do have to watch it and guard it because we don't want to lose the aircraft.
Yeah, and that's something where a casual onlooker would never even consider that, right? And then you start talking about water and rocks, and as the water goes over the rock, the top, that water is accelerating over the top of the rock, right? So now you have higher winds at higher elevations, and that's something that we just typically wouldn't see or learn about.
Exactly. And if you start digging into that, then you get into the old Bernoulli equation, and you say, oh, wow, we're getting pressure differentials across that spectrum and the lift associated on the wing. And so there's a lot that goes into it. Again, like I always describe our air tanker pilots as Major League Baseball hitters. They're hitting the fastball, and they're doing a hell of a great job with it. But their batting average is a little bit better than 300. They're batting about 950. They have to be, right?
Yeah.
Right? So,
yeah. Your pilots, speaking of them, is it still CAL FIRE owns aircraft, and the pilots and maintenance is done through a contractor?
Yeah, affirmative. So the primary pilots who we contract with, who fly our fixed-wing aircraft, are through Amentum, which is the they provide both the maintenance and the pilots for our aircraft for the fixed wing. The helicopter pilots on the CAL FIRE marked ships are all CAL FIRE employees. So they're on and they're available year-round as CAL FIRE pilots.
Is there any friendly competition between the fixed wing and the helicopter pilots?
Oh, yeah. It's funny to get them in the same room together.
That's funny. How have you seen aerial firefighting change over the past, let's say, 10 years to what you see now in terms of number of incidences or techniques? And then what do you see going forward? What's the future of this?
Yeah. The thing that I'm watching the most right now is just because of the intensity of the fires that we're seeing, we're finding that bigger aircraft are having a much more dramatic effect on the fire. So right now we're working towards getting some C-130s included in our air program, and so we can do heavier maintenance on the S-2s. It's been 20 years just about since many of them started kind of their second life as an air tanker, and now we want to be able to do more maintenance on them because some of our bases can only support the S2. So at Grass Valley, to help ensure that program happens, we're looking to move into some C-130 aircraft. They just have to have the structural components, tank installed, and so it's a little time-consuming process. But eventually you'll probably see one here at Chico. So that'll replace the S2 air tanker here at Chico. And I think that'll be very beneficial. It'll carry 4,000 gallons rather than 1,200 gallons. And then the other thing we see is the Black Hawk helicopter has had a dramatic impact. That is, it's got a 1,000-gallon tank versus back in the day we carried a Bambi bucket that would carry a little over 300 gallons. And so dramatic increase in the amount of water it can carry depending on where it's pulling from. It can carry typically about 600 gallons on each drop to the fire, maximum 1,000 depending on how much lift they can generate, and they still have the hand crew on board. But at some point CAL FIRE is going to start moving that aircraft also towards night flying. So it was bought with the intention of being able to have some night flying aircraft, and that's going to be a huge transition for CAL FIRE. And it's a very dangerous environment at night. And so they've got a very dedicated, safe program that's coming on board. And hopefully we're going to see some of those aircraft start to transition this summer.
And what would be the mission of a Black Hawk flying at night? How does that differ from daytime ops? I'm assuming humidities are higher typically, so you have different fire behavior, and so they're trying to basically get more bang for the buck by flying at night. Is that
Affirmative.
Right? Okay.
Yep. We're finding that the fires aren't settling down at night anymore like they used to. So if we can get an aircraft over the top of it to be able to offer a little bit of help with water, we'll never be able to fly the fixed wing, or it's going to be a much bigger challenge to fly the fixed wing in those low visibility conditions. But the helicopters have a lot more benefit for that moving forward. So, and then the last aircraft that we're really starting to field that's coming on board now is the drones. And so when we talk about drones, we call them unmanned aerial systems. And so typically it'll be a small UAS that is has a very good thermal and electro-optical camera so that we can see through the smoke. So some of those smoky conditions that I was talking about earlier, we can start to see through it, and we can start to have an effective intel of where the fire is and what the fire is doing moving forward. Some of the UASs that we're getting are getting a little bigger, and we're actually being able to drop ping pong balls now, what we call ping pong balls. They're just round spherical balls that are filled with potassium permanganate. We inject a little ethylene glycol from the drone, and about 30 seconds later, it ignites a fire. And we've used that successfully to walk fire down a hill. It's a lot easier to do it at night when the humidity's up and the sun is off the hillside, and so we don't destroy as much when we have to backfire around a community. It's a lot easier going for that, a lot safer.
Unmanned aircraft going forward.
Yes.
That's a big part of it.
And then the other aircraft that we've really started to dive into this year is the Intel aircraft. So they have great sensors that are coming on board some of these aircraft. And when I started out as a firefighter, if you got an updated map the next morning, you were doing good. Now they're producing maps at a pretty good clip. So several times a day we're getting updated fire perimeter maps of where the fire is and what the threat potential is. So that's flying way over the top of all our aircraft, and it's just mowing the lawn that we call, and picking up that heat signature and then being able to transpose it onto a map.
So you get better information, better decision making from that.
At a much quicker pace.
Yeah, interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I would think an additional benefit of those Blackhawks going at night, because you can actually see the flame through the smoke, so you're going to be more easily hitting your seat of the fire versus being blinded by the smoke during the day.
Yeah, they've got the NVGs on, so it gives them a pretty good sight picture of what's going on.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So current state, in the news right now, we hear a lot about pilot shortages for the airlines. Is that affecting your operations as well, and how do you plan for that?
Yeah, it is. Absolutely. We are having a lot of difficulty hiring and maintaining pilots right now. So for the most part, there are some that are coming out of the military on the Black Hawk side that we've been able to grab, and they've been great assets to the department. And then on the fixed wing side, a lot of pilots just like to fly for CAL FIRE. So we've been blessed with having some pretty senior industry air tanker pilots want to come to work for CAL FIRE. But when I first started, the pilots were working long days. They'd work 6 days on and have 1 day off every week. And what we found is that wasn't good for their life, their families, and to make it more attractive to bring pilots into CAL FIRE, the corporation we contract with has changed their work week from 6 days on, 1 day off to 10 days on, 5 days off, which makes it a little easier for them to get home, spend time with their family before they have to come back to the base and continue working.
If someone wanted to get into this, there's the aviation side, there's the CAL FIRE, the management side. How would, if they wanted to fly an OV-10 and with you, what's the steps that a young person would take to get into this?
So first off, they got to get their pilot's license. Once they get that base pilot's license, then there's several certificates that they have to get to be able to be selected for this. Well, one of the biggest constraints is getting twin turbine time. Those are the engines that are powering the aircraft, and getting time flying a twin aircraft and with twin turbines is very daunting for a lot of pilots. So if they don't come from the military, a lot of our pilots come from the military. We have some great pilots who are working throughout the state who have been through the Air Force Academy. Several of the pilots that I've worked with, one of the pilots who I worked with last summer, he flew the U-2. And so he was a U-2 pilot. The other pilot I worked with, she spent a lot of time flying for the Forest Service and contractors who worked with the Forest Service. Some of the pilots have come from Alaska. They'll go up to Alaska and they'll fly cargo in Alaska in very daunting conditions, challenging conditions, high altitude, off-site landings, and so they have a lot of good experience coming from that. So you see a big mix, but just getting hours in the aircraft is huge.
In addition to helicopter and fixed wing pilots, with all the drones, you're talking about the trend for more and more drones to be used in piloting a drone. Do they have to go through the same training that a regular pilot does, or is it very different because of the nature of you're on the ground with a joystick, basically?
Yeah, exactly. So you are on the ground. They do require you to get a Part 107 pilot's license, which is the commercial FAA drone pilot's license. And then from that, we have 2 courses that we go to. So the first one is we confirm that they're going to be good stick wigglers, right? So they're going to be able to fly that drone safely. And then we free them up to be able to work at the unit level, to be able to fly it on a VMP or help with a search and rescue mission or many of the ancillary programs that we do within CAL FIRE. And then the The next class was what we call S-373, and that's where you learn to operate the drone in the vicinity of the other aircraft. So how do you contact the AirTac, and how do you get clearance, and how do you maintain that separation of the aircraft in the fire traffic area?
What determines end of fire season for you? Like, when do the aircraft go back to McClellan or wherever they're going to be stored?
You know, what drives everything in CAL FIRE is what the weather conditions on the ground are. And so the chiefs in the state will take a look at what the weather conditions across the region is, and they'll say, you know what, we're finally getting to the conditions where we're not going to have a threat potential, or the threat potential is going to be so minimized that the ground guys can pick up the fire without the additional help from the aircraft, and that's when they send it back. It's actually very important to kind of get those aircraft back to McClellan, because they have such rigorous maintenance cycles on them that we have to get them back in so that they'll be available if we have an early fire season the next year. So it's kind of a risk versus gain thing, but we do try to expedite getting the aircraft back as soon as possible. But they also will not sacrifice the safety of a community. So just this week, I was helping out covering the Porterville AirTac because they were still staffed.
I just have one more question for you. What would you say are, as an agency, but also locally with what you do, what are your biggest challenges going forward?
Biggest challenge that I foresee coming up is every fire season I worry about what the smoke conditions are going to be and whether we're going to be able to get off and be able to perform our mission. That's a very difficult decision on how we mitigate that every year. Certainly want to, but that is probably one of the things that I worry about the most. And then also just maintaining the program in general. So to become an AirTac, it takes a lot of training. It's a lot of commitment from an employee. And so you got to find the right dedicated employee who's willing to sacrifice more than the standard employee to be able to complete the training requirements.
For the most part, you're just delivering whether it's retardant or water, agents onto the fire. Do you ever get involved with moving of personnel, like smoke jumpers and that sort of thing, to get them into hard to get to areas? Do you do that, or is that a different agency?
So the Forest Service does that, and we work across the boundaries with our Forest Service partners. So the closest air resources go regardless of who has jurisdiction. So you'll typically see a Forest Service AirTac over the top of a CAL FIRE incident, or vice versa, a CAL FIRE AirTac over the top of a Forest Service incident. We just try to get the closest resources to help the people of California. It doesn't matter. They don't care about the patch, and so we try to get those resources there. But yes, the Forest Service has the smoke jumpers available out of Redding, and typically they'll have about 40 of them every year. Great resource to be able to get into some of those high remote areas. Really good firefighters. And then on the CAL FIRE side, we have helitac crews that are staffed throughout the state. And so, yeah, we'll put our helicopters into hard to remote areas. And the real benefit with the Black Hawk helicopter is if we do have to shuttle a whole bunch of people in, it makes it so much easier when you have a bigger, more powerful aircraft, more capable aircraft with more seats to be able to have more people per flight. So it makes it a lot more efficient.
Very good. The last question is just, of all the different fires you've worked on, is there anything that stands out as the agency's kind of your greatest accomplishment, or where everybody came out high-fiving everybody that you nailed it?
Every year, so most of our fires every year, CAL FIRE's goal is to try to keep 90% of our fires at 10 acres or less. And so those are the ones that I really enjoy. Those are the ones where we go in, we save somebody's home, where we do positive things. The firefighters on the ground pull in quick. Everything works together as a nice flow. Those are the fires that I really enjoy. The bigger fires, not so much. They're a lot more challenging work.
The horses already left the barn.
It is, yeah.
Battalion Chief Shem Hawkins, thank you for coming in. Air Tactical Group Supervisor at the Chico Air Attack Base. Appreciate your time, and I think this is a topic that is we've seen so much coverage on over the last few years, especially, and we really appreciate your perspective and the knowledge that you bring into this interview. So, thank you very much.
Great, thank you. I appreciate your time.
You bet.
Thank you for listening to the QTAC Fire Podcast. We look forward to you listening in the future. If you'd like to connect with us, follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube at QTAC Fire.